Hi there, my name's Dr. Stewart Desson. I'm here at the International Congress of Applied Psychology in Montreal, and I've just given a short talk on my PhD research findings around evaluative bias in psychometrics. I'm going to summarize 3 of the key findings here for you now. So the first one was around the topic of evaluative bias. What is it? Is it just social desirability? Well, it's somewhat more than social desirability. Evaluative bias occurs when the actual questions in a questionnaire have clearly got one end more attractive than the other. And this is pretty evident if we look at Goldberg's adjectives for measuring the big 5, where, for example, the extroverted adjectives such as bold are more attractive than the introverted adjectives such as timid and shy. So, having quantified that evaluative bias is a feature of many Big 5 models, can we remove it? And the answer, based on my research, is yes. So, using Peabody's method from 1967, we can measure both ends of the scale, both adaptively and maladaptively. So, if we're looking at something like, say, extroversion, we can measure I like to engage and chat to people, that's extroversion positively, but we can also measure it maladaptively and look at maybe I talk too much. And secondly, we can look at introversion adaptively. For example, I like to listen before I give my view, and introversion maladaptively with something like sometimes I listen too much and I can become passive. So this method does effectively reduce evaluative bias, and my PhD findings have quantified that. The second key finding I wanted to share was around the usefulness of this idea. How does the concept of reducing evaluative bias actually impact validity? Well, the first observation is that if we can measure validity more broadly by saying we've measured both ends in many, many ways, we've arguably measured the full construct. Some instruments just measure one end, say just extroversion, not introversion at all. And when they do that, they just measure extroversion very positively. But arguably, you've not actually measured the full construct if you do this. And if you do it in a very narrow way, as some instruments do, you're at risk of what Cattell called a bloated specific in your measurement. The reverse of that, taking into account the risk of evaluative bias, measures the whole construct holistically and therefore has greater validity. The other bit to validity is criterion validity. So in my PhD, I had a look and quantified, does measuring both ends and adaptive, maladaptive actually help when you're correlating with performance at work? And a simple answer to that is yes, it does. We find it's not just the typical positive ends of the polarities in the Big 5 that correlate well with performance at work, but some of the reverse ends, the other polarities do as well, particularly when measured adaptively. So for example, in order to deliver results, it's not just being conscientious that helps. We also find that openness or big picture thinking, if we are low on that, there can be some benefits to that as well. We call that being down to earth and sensible and evidence based. So that was the second finding I was sharing around the PhD. And finally, the third finding on the PhD was around the concept of overextending. Now in the research, initially I called this maladaptive behaviors or dark side behaviors, but a key finding was reframing this as just too much of a good thing. So looking at too much extroversion becoming a bit domineering, or too much introversion becoming somewhat passive. This is a very helpful way to reframe what others might call maladaptive, and it turns out it's not always maladaptive. Sometimes I might think I'm doing too much of something, but it could actually be helpful in a certain context. And sometimes I might not think I'm overextending, but viewed through the lens of somebody else, they may see it as too much. So in the research, I rather helpfully correlated this idea of overextended with other more traditional views of maladaptive traits to see how they correlated. On the whole, there was found to be a pretty high degree of compatibility between what others might call a dark side trait and an overextension of the Big 5. However, a key finding is that by linking it to the Big 5 from a user validity perspective, it becomes a much more understandable and coherent model for people to interpret. So those are the key 3 findings. Does evaluative bias exist? It does. And can we reduce it? Yes. The second finding is around, is it useful in terms of validity, and the answer is yes. And finally, is the idea of overextending helpful? And the answer is a big yes to that as well. So I hope you found that overview useful. Thank you.